One of the challenges that I face as an unemployed man is trying to get people to understand how much the job market has changed over the last 40 years. Now, I have a father who, when he first came into the job market, he tries to give me advice, but he's coming from a 1950s, 1960s perspective. And from that perspective, it was a lot easier for anyone to get a job than it is today. Because if a man walked into a business and said he was looking for work, the owner of that business would look that guy over and ask him a couple of questions. And by the next day or that same day, that guy was working. And in my brother's time, which was the 1980s, the job market, while it had changed some, was pretty much almost similar. Now, when he went out there, you could pound the pavement and go from place to place looking for work. You could go to temp agencies and fill out applications there, or you could go into a business and talk to people there. And again, you could walk in, and if a guy looked you over, he pretty much was and liked you. You were pretty much again working that same day, or you were working the next day. Now, when I came into the job market in the 1990s, things had changed. We had just had a really bad recession under the Bush administration, and we had gone from that easy job market where you could just walk in someplace and get a job and be working the next day or the same day to a different job market where nothing was really stable. And people who used to go through that process of walking in someplace and having a job and being able to get a job easy found themselves in a very tumultuous place, because in the job market I came into, things weren't stable. People went from, again, that job market where you could just walk in someplace and have a job for 20 or 25 years to a job market where you were lucky if you had a job for 5 years if you got it, or a couple months if you were lucky. And that was the job market that I came into, and it was a lot harder to find any sort of work in it because everything was started to destabilize. Um, and these days, the job market is really, really severely unstable, and we've gone from a job market again in the 90s to about, I say, 2005, where if you got a job, you would have it for 5 years, to a job market where you're lucky if you have a job for 18 months to 2 years. And the process for getting jobs these days is a lot more difficult than it was, again, in the 60s, where my father was in the job market, or the 80s when my brother was in the job market, to today, where I'm trying to find another job after coming through the unstable 1990s job market to this total, complete disaster. I mean, when I first came into the job market, you could still go to you had to go through the temp agencies, and a lot of them are not very open to helping people unless they have a whole bunch of experience. And I didn't have that much experience in the beginning, and then even when I had experience, they were still giving me a hard time. When it comes down to these temp agencies, they're very picky, and again, they're very gynocentric, because that's one of the things I noticed. If a woman walks into a temp agency, she can pretty much have her pick of administrative assistant jobs. But if a man walks in there, it becomes a bit of a challenge to place that guy. Really don't want to put men in offices. Some people say it's because some of these managers fear that black men are going to go after lust after white women. I could care less about white women, and that's a really silly notion as I see it. And others want to talk about, they're afraid that you're going to mess up their company. And this is another notion that some of these people have, that you're not, because you don't have any experience, you're going to mess things up. But what can you mess up? You're making copies, doing basic data entry. You're trying to learn the skills so that you can get better, so you can get better skills. That's all a temp job is. But some people, they fear that you're going to mess them up. And that's what I ran into in the 1990s. But this 21st century job market is one of the most disturbing things that I've ever run into, because After 9/11, you can't pound the pavement anymore. Um, 9/11, before 9/11, you could pretty much walk into different office buildings, go into there, um, and go into these temp agencies and spend your day filling out a bunch of applications and hoping somebody would call you. But after 9/11, many of these office towers started tightening up their security. And if you did not have an appointment to be a certain place, you weren't allowed access into that building. That's just how many of these buildings work now. You cannot just walk in, you cannot pound the pavement anymore. And what's furthermore grating about it is these days, most application processes for jobs are now done online. So if you don't have a computer, you're not going to be able to go out and look for work, because that's how people look for work. And the whole thing is, I understand that problem drastically, because back in 2007, when my first laptop died, I pretty much did not have a computer. So thank God I was able to fill out that civil service application before that computer died. But because I was out of a computer for a year, and if you don't have a computer these days, you are not going to be able to apply for any jobs. And then even if you do apply for jobs online, the chances of getting a response are pretty much slim to none. I mean, it happens here and there, but your chances are very, very, very low, due to these online application processes. And these online applications are a nightmare to deal with. The old paper applications used to be, name, address, phone number, work experience. Today, with these online applications, the information can vary. Some of them will be asking for really personal information like social security numbers. Some of them will even ask for selective service numbers, stuff that is just insane. They'll ask for all this information, and you won't get a response for them. And then on top of it, they ask you to take these personality tests or these other types of tests. And the tests, they are repetitive, they're redundant, and you have to try to slough through them in the hopes that someone will respond. And I've applied at numerous places, such as your Targets, your Walmarts, your Michaels, many of these retail stores, and they have these big long personality tests, and they are very hard to get through. And a lot of people don't understand, how hard it is to try to fill out these applications, try to figure out, how to get through these personality tests, and what do they even have to do with this job. Um, when I deal with these applications, a lot of people they think that it's just you not trying hard enough, or you're not pushing hard enough. But these days, again, it's very, very hard to get to a person, because you have to jump through so many hoops online. It's not like, again, the old days where you went directly to a person. The person saw that you were looking for work, and then if they liked you, they hired you. These days, you have to go through a whole host of processes, and that's just the basic process for the application. If you come in for the interview, because I got one interview for Target, didn't get it, but they then ask you a bunch of questions, and then after that, there's a whole host of other processes like background checks, drug tests. There's a whole bunch of hoops someone has to jump through just to get a job that pays $9 an hour. And a lot of people don't understand that. They think it's just, oh, you just walk in and you can just be working. No, that's not the process now. It's a bigger, longer process, and they go through your background, they check your credit and all this other stuff. And some of these companies even ask for a whole host of references on top of it. And and it becomes like a whole host of roadblocks and a whole bunch of hurdles. Again, just for a $9 or $10 an hour job. And a lot of people think that it's just you not trying hard enough, and that you can try to persuade people to take you on. And that's just not how it's done anymore. The job process has become very, very impersonal and very indifferent these days, it's a total contrast to the personal way things are. And then when you try to explain this to people, they really just don't understand this 21st century job market and why it's so difficult to get jobs, because you really these days can't really start pushing people or prodding people or getting in people's faces these days to try to sell them, because there is nobody to sell. Everything is done through computers, and if you try to really try to deal with people on that level, where you're trying to call yourself pushing them and selling them, you may wind up alienating them, because today's people are very, very different than they were 20 years ago or 40 years ago, where people were more open to people. People today, after 9/11, they've become a lot more closed off, and they really don't trust anyone. So if you try to call yourself trying to push them or trying to prod them, you may wind up having to deal with security guards or police officers, especially if you're a black guy like me. You really cannot, start getting into people's faces too much. So you don't really want to argue with someone, and arguing really doesn't help anything, or argue with someone over their job. That's their job. If they don't want to give it to you, then they don't want to give it to you. But you try to explain this to people and they don't really understand it, that it's a really delicate situation out there, because I look at the post 9/11 world, and people really, again, are not very open to other people. Everybody is really, really, they're really closed off to each other, and everything is really, these days really, really has become friend of a friend, and everybody wants to be. They've really gotten insular. If you look at the American job market, it's very insular, and I think that's a lot of that has to do with a lot of people still being traumatized over 9/11, and they're very afraid that if they let outsiders in to things like their business, that person may hurt them or it may hurt their business. But business is a place where you have to take risks, and really, in today's business world, a lot of people aren't open to people who are outside of their group, outside of their values, and outside of their ideas. Again, I go back to 9/11, and I can see the trauma that came from that when I study the history of the American job market. And I look at my own employment situation, and it's hard to, again, access people when you're an outsider, because 98% of the jobs these days, or 95 really, are gotten through contacts and people who are inside, and that's up from the 80 some percent that it was back in the 1990s when I started looking in the job market. It's gotten really, really insular than it was 20 years ago, and today's job market is very, very, insular. If you don't know a lot of people, or you're a person who struggles with anxiety and is a very shy person like I am, it's very hard to make connections with people, because people throw up walls, and because they're throwing up these walls, you can't reach them, you can't connect to them, and you can't form professional connections with them, because they're afraid you're going to mess them up. You're afraid you're going to make them fail. They're afraid that they can't trust you. But in business, you really need people who are outside, because one, they can give you a unique perspective on things, and two, you can objectively supervise them. This is why a lot of businesses struggle these days, because they have too many people who are too close to the picture, and they're not objective, so they can't really see what direction to take their business in. Um, I look at the job market and I try to explain things to people, and they think that it's like it was back when they first came in, but it has changed extremely in the last, I say, 25 years, and again, it's becoming more insular, and it's becoming much harder for outsiders like myself to enter into any company, or even try to even talk to someone just to get an interview. It was hard to get an interview in the 1990s, and it's much harder now. And you have so many hoops just to go through just to get some sort of 9 or 10 or $11 an hour job, and that makes job search is a bit of a nightmare these days, and people, they really need to take a look at how we, communicate with each other in the job market, because I look at the way people are communicating, and it's not very productive, because we're not get people like myself are not being able to access the job market, one, and two, the productivity is stalling because you can't find qualified people, and most of the people you're finding are insiders, and insiders really can't open up new markets or create new jobs for people. What they're doing to do with an insider is because they're so close up, they don't have a vision to see anything new and different. Um, so they can't really focus on what needs to be done. They're too busy trying to hold on to what they have, instead of trying to find a way to let go of it so that they can get more. It's a lot of fear in the American job market these days, and that fear, I believe, is really preventing people like myself from being able to enter into it and find a way to make a living for ourselves. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.